Chapter 8. Vittoria's heart threatened to pound out of her chest as she stared at all those eyes, all those witches fixated on her, a lavanda maid. No, a future High Priestess. Mateo stood like a fearless sentinel beside her. He seemingly had no qualms, no sense of terror at the enormity of what he strove to do. She understood little of this political game, but she did know that asking the workers for their opinion on anything was a fast shot to death at the hands of landowners. Up until this very moment, Vittoria had felt as if this were all a vague dream, perhaps some half-baked joke that would end as soon as someone jumped out and laughed at her for going along with it. "You," they would say, "a lavanda maid? How could you possibly be the High Priestess?" But Mateo was so clever. He had made sure the workers had seen her face, known her for her generosity. The last several months suddenly made sense. How could they reject her? It was an oddly reassuring realization. Mateo reached out, a hand on her arm. He stood at the edge still, gazing out on the crowd. His brow had wrinkled. "Mateo?" she murmured, startled by the strange expression on his face. "Look." When she followed his gaze, a breeze ruffled the magnolia flowers strapped over her heart. The crowd shifted below, starting from the front. The movement rippled backward, one witch at a time. Once she comprehended what was happening, her breath whooshed out of her all at once. The witches were kneeling. Workers in every street dropped to one knee, heads tilted back to face her. They held a hand over their left shoulder in the gesture of approval. A hushed reverence fell over the city, punctuated only by occasional murmurs, until every witch in sight had knelt. Hot, scalding tears filled Vittoria's eyes. "Your witches," he said gently, "approve." Swallowing hard, Vittoria dropped to one knee, hand over her left shoulder in return. A blast of sound broke out when she stood back to her feet. Witches stood, calling out with indiscernible words. The ruckus of approval rose even louder than Mateo's deep voice. He pulled her into his side with a heavy arm, and she felt anchored to his strength with gratitude. They stood there for a full minute, the sound rolling like thunder. No backing out now, nor would she wish to. An echo lived bright in her mind as she faced those thousands of witches. There was an eruption of sound, and several shrill screams came from the ground on the right. Vittoria whirled to see what had happened just as Mateo pushed her toward Bernat. "Come, lady," said Bernat. "I will see you safe. Witches are starting to act out below." "Go," Mateo added with a nod. "I'll be there soon." Vittoria turned away with Bernat, then stopped. Standing on the rooftop of a neighboring building was a bent-over old man. His white hair stood in sharp contrast to the sooty roof tiles behind him, and his cold eyes pierced hers with a chill. High Priest Hode. Vittoria paused to regard him for only a moment before Bernat guided her down the stairs and into an enclosed room where they could transport away without being followed. She shivered in the wake of those cold eyes. The next morning, wind brushed across Vittoria's cheeks. She stood in the sunshine, eyes closed. The touch of sunlight tingled on her skin. She soaked up the bright air with a sense of relief. She had the luxury of standing in sunshine instead of a lavanda hovel. Open sea air, a lovely breeze. There would be no sneaky Andreas to boss her around, no scrubbing fabrics in hot water, no caustic potions on her hands. Nothing but this. The thought that she might never return to the lavanda life both thrilled and terrified her. What if she had to go back? How could this plan ever work? She felt nearly unable to comprehend a life where she didn't have to scrub her vitality away. The sound of singing swords came from behind her. She half-spun to see Bernat and Mateo locked in a tangle of weapons and spraying sand. Advance, retreat, clang, parry, grunt. The animalistic side of Mateo startled her. Until now, she'd only seen his gentle gaze, quick smile, kind eyes, witty laugh. This was entirely new, almost primal. His strength seemed all but unfailing in the dazzle of sun on sword. In the far distance, she could just make out Magnolia Castle through the haze of the ocean. It cut an odd figure in the mist. She turned away from it. There would be time enough for considering her place in that world, givers willing. Two of Bernat's men guarded the perimeter of the house. One watched over the ridge of sand, stone, and scrub that hid them. The other strode around, eyes darting here and there. When he passed her, he nodded, but remained silent. Their broad shoulders and thick thighs, unusually strong for workers, made them prowl more like predators than guardians. She wondered where Mateo had found them. He'd need them, no doubt. Her stomach dropped as she thought of what lay ahead. She'd avoided thinking about the inevitable tests last night. She'd just tried to get through the betrothal. It felt strange to open her thoughts to it so wholly now, because the tests were the next step. The test of courage came in 4 days. The test of magic would follow 2 weeks later. Then the battle against Romeo after 2 more weeks. Less than 5 weeks in all. That's all she knew. Their hand-fasting at some point, perhaps? She couldn't imagine hand-fasting with the law of rights in the background. Would it be better to hand-fast him before the final battle or after? What if there was no after? Vittoria turned her thoughts from that path. Of course Mateo could die, but why focus on it? If they hand-fasted after he succeeded, her family could be safely invited. Would he allow her a simple ceremony? Must it happen in the castle? She smiled as she thought of Nico dressed up. They'd buy him new clothes. He wouldn't be so gaunt or pale. Assuming Mateo defeated Romeo, they'd likely move into the castle. No leader would live in a shack, surely, even one so luxurious as this. That meant landowners would be part of her daily life. She'd have to play hostess, deal with the political process, and maybe have children. Vittoria blanched. Givers. She hadn't thought of that. Her mind barreled down the path of the future, despite every attempt to stop it, leading to her greatest fear of all. How was she to be High Priestess in this brand new world? The workers who knelt before her last night had effectively committed treason against the High Priest, protected only by their sheer numbers and the threat of rebel retaliation. Those workers now had expectations of her as their future High Priestess. They wanted her to lead them to a better life. All the elation of yesterday faded to an uncertain whisper of doubt. How can I do this? Despite how little she knew Mateo, her growing sense of respect for him was real enough. They would be friends, if not lovers, more than she might have expected as a lavanda maid. Many girls hand-fasted out of desperation or loneliness, though she'd be a fool if she didn't admit she felt something for Mateo. Stirrings, hope, a confused sense of safety, maybe? Was it more than that? Vittoria suppressed the urge to watch him, shirtless and sweaty in the sand. He'd protect her and her family. She knew that, if nothing else. The thought bolstered her. She was here for them, wasn't she? For them, she could do anything. Even be High Priestess, particularly to such a handsome High Priest. For now, it was enough. Vittoria sighed and glanced around. A wall of stone and sand lay behind the tricky little house. Mateo's sprawling home looked as small as a titi hovel, a nest for a mouse, from the outside. More of an old shed than anything. Within, however, was a sprawling, comfortable home with windows, doors, and so much natural light. It was 5 times larger than anything she'd ever known, though still humble by landowner standards. Breakfast, prepared by Zuri, waited on a tray inside. Vittoria regarded it again, head tilted. She'd never eaten in the morning because they always ate all their food at dinner as a family. Landowners did, though. It seemed an odd luxury. Would she need to? With the song of swords in the background, she slipped back inside and stripped to her chemise. Then she bustled around the room that Zuri had said was her own. Majesty says to make yourself comfortable, Zuri had said with a warm smile. It would be his room, but he prefers to sleep outside. Men are strange that way, although, this close to the sea, it is tempting. To keep her absolute terror at bay, Vittoria rearranged the room. She slipped all the books and parchments into a box that she tucked into the corner. She couldn't read yet, so why look at them? She stripped a sheet off the bed and moved things around until the whole room looked as if a storm had blown through it. 10 minutes later, she stepped back to regard her creation. In the far corner, up against the wall and the floor-length window that overlooked the beach, she'd shoved the most comfortable chair. Then she'd taken sheets and tucked their corners into 2 hanging pots. The result was a screen that hid the chair, a pillow, and a large chunk of ocean and sky. It would be her space. Bare, empty, small, minimal, just like home. A mirror, an armoire, a hanging bed, and an actual painting of La Principessa remained behind. She'd only seen paintings from a distance before. In this one, La Principessa knelt near a small child and his crying mother, a gentle glow of light around her hands. Here, La Principessa's features were quite young. Not much older than Vittoria's, in fact. The boy looked like a Nico, which stilled her aching, swollen heart. He held a magnolia flower, presumably gifted to him by La Principessa. Vittoria sat in her hiding spot, her back pressed to the wall, and breathed. The chill of the wall permeated through her ribs, into her body. It centered her like a shot of gravity. Her mind calmed. The edges of ragged panic settled into something not unlike curiosity, maybe terror. There was a fine line between them. "Vittoria?" The booming voice came from behind her closed door. Vittoria's eyes popped open. Mateo, not Zuri as she'd expected. A gentle knock followed the sound of her name. "I'm here," she called from behind the sheet. Mateo entered the room with quiet footfalls. He paused, then advanced to her hiding spot. The curtain slowly parted to reveal his face. He was sweaty, still dressed in a white shirt unbuttoned to the center of his chest. Thick brown breeches hugged his legs to the floor, where he wore leather shoes. His chest still heaved a little from the exertion. "You are well?" he asked with a sparkle of amusement in his eye. Seeing him stilled some of the wild anxiety in her chest. They still hardly knew each other, but he calmed her all the same. "Yes." Her shoulders relaxed a little. "I'm doing well." He gestured to the hanging sheet. "Hiding?" She gave a slow smile. "Perhaps." "Good. Sometimes we all need to." "I've been thinking about last night. What did you hear when you went back to Necci?" She leaned forward, eager to hear what La Salvatore had discovered. Mateo and Benat had been out in the covens until late. She'd heard their whispers as they returned, but had been too sleepy to leave the comfort of her new bed. "Nothing new." His brow wrinkled as he wiped a bead of sweat off his cheek. "More hopeful talk about Mateo overall. No attacks or rebel business, however, which surprised me." "Does it mean something?" He frowned slightly. "Maybe. It could mean they aren't organized enough to take advantage of such an unexpected opportunity for chaos." He shrugged. "Or maybe they're surprised, curious, overly cautious. It's hard to tell." He glanced around her room, clearly bored with the topic. "You are comfortable in here? Zuri gets you everything you need?" "Yes, it's lovely. Thank you. I slept better than usual last night. The ocean so close is lulling." "Very," he grinned, "like a lullaby." She gestured around her. It feels like too much, though." "It does at first, but soon I hope you'll grow comfortable with it. There's something powerful about having your own space." Vittoria fidgeted with the fold of her dress. She'd never had her own space. "My family, are they all right?" "Yes," he chuckled. "Benat's men were quite taken with Nico. They gave him a wooden sword, and he's been hacking at bushes. They're settled in a small house near the quarry. I checked on them myself yesterday. Later, at dinner, I'll take you to them." Vittoria's first full smile found her. "Thank you," she cried with relief. "I can't wait to see a Nico with real toys." Mateo chuckled again. "He's quite fierce with that sword. The apothecary will be there soon to see your pair. Today, I hope. Your mare agreed to help me with some things at the quarry. They're happy." Vittoria beamed. "Thank you, Mateo." He nodded. "Zuri will come and go if you need anything, but you can help yourself as well. Food is in the kitchen, blankets in the hall, that sort of thing." "Thank you." Mateo studied her for a moment, and she wondered what he saw. Her fear, her relief, her homesickness already, maybe all of it. He extended a hand. "Come with me. There is something we should look at together. I owe you a full explanation of what's to come with the Law of Rights, and this may be the best place to start. Then we can talk about your place in my plan to help the network find stability again." Vittoria stood and accepted his hand. The warmth of his palm was reassurance against all the doubt. Her fears vanished in the certainty that they would venture into this unknown world together. "What is it you want to show me?" His expression turned grim. "The arena, which is where the test of courage will take place. It's in the place of my victory or my grave. Might as well go now, while I'm sweaty. We won't get any cooler out there." Vittoria's head spun as the transportation spell ended. Mateo held onto her arm as she attempted to gather her wits. For all its conveniences, magic was not a fun experience. The spinning sensation ebbed, which took the wobble out of her knees. Mateo put a heavy hand on her shoulder. The weight grounded her. She opened her eyes to find him only a breath away. "Better?" Not recognizing any of her surroundings, she simply nodded. Heavy, dense air pressed upon her, wet and thick all the way to her lungs. A trickle of sweat ran down her spine. Greenery tickled the back of her neck like reaching fingers. She shivered and stepped away, only to feel the frond of a fern on her arm. The Saltu jungle. Mateo clasped her hand with his and tugged her to stand in front of him. He pressed a finger to his mouth to indicate a need for silence, then gestured behind her with one finger. Vittoria glanced overhead, then behind. Thick branches tangled in a dense jungle canopy. Curling vines, leaves as tall as her body, and cascading flowers created the appearance of a ceiling. So many shades of green unfolded before her, she couldn't even count them. Just beyond the foliage lay hints of a bright sky. "What is that?" she mouthed as Banat and two of his men faded into the jungle. She pointed toward where a vague shape seemed to coalesce. His lips brushed the shell of her ear as he whispered, "The landowners call it the Poena. It's the arena where the first test of courage will take place. It means the agony." She shivered. The Poena wasn't the only danger here. Ghost panthers ruled the Saltu. They were dark as night and mean as Hode. Witches in the farmlands in the city feared the jungle. While fleeing the farmlands years ago, Vittoria and her family had been forced to skirt the edges of the Saltu on the way to Nechi. She recalled the strange noises and shifting shadows with a bone-deep shudder. Mateo motioned her forward a few steps, then pulled away the foliage. She peered between thick, glossy leaves to see the world fall away beneath them. They stood at the edge of a massive crater the shape of an oval. Rich, black earth had been excavated away until it reached muddy sand fathoms below. The entirety of the hole could house Magnolia Castle 10 times over. On the far side, the jungle spilled over the edge and into the middle of the arena. Plants sprang to life along the ground before her very eyes, unfurling a leaf at a time. The sheer height of the straight drop made her dizzy. Around the edge of the Poena were seats for spectators. Each row of seats was wider than the last, until the final row stopped just below the tree line. Vittoria stood with Mateo at the edge of that layer now, barely hidden in the foliage. Workers were carving more seats into the Poena with tools that looked like long, flat scrapers, flattening the earth and then discarding the extra into a bucket. Mud coated their calves and arms in the sweltering heat. A lower-level landowner followed them. The muddy benches hardened behind him, apparently with magic. He eyed the workers warily. Red stripes across their backs dripped blood in crossed lines. A whip hung from the landowner's hand. "By the givers." Mateo pulled her back. She doubted they'd be seen, but she was relieved to look away anyway. Banat returned with a nod to Mateo. "This is where the first test of courage will happen," Mateo said, just loudly enough to be heard over the sounds of the jungle. Banat stood near them, head cocked as he peered into the Saltu. She wondered if Mateo felt any fear. If not, she felt enough for both of them. "In 4 days, Romeo and I will meet down there to prove our courage." His stoic expression didn't waver, but his voice softened a little. "The actual task will be unknown until we both arrive." "Who decides the task?" "Historically, the head of guardians. Since Per has given that title to himself, then it goes to the second in command. That is an ambitious witch named Balta, who wants to be the head of guardians and would do a good job of it. Of course, Per shares nothing, certainly not power," he said sardonically. Then he gave her a little wink that loosened some of the tightness in her chest. "So the task could be anything." "Anything. But I'm willing to bet it has something to do with the jungle, considering." He motioned to the labyrinthine greenery below. He was probably right. She doubted the jungle would spill into the Poena otherwise. "Are you prepared to kill your brother?" "No, not remotely." He sighed heavily. "Fortunately, we don't fight each other yet. I have to wrap my mind around it." She shuddered. "Barbaric, the whole law of rights." "Effective," he shrugged. "It has been invoked in the Castaneda family 6 times, only once by a brother. Most were cousins. One was between an uncle and a nephew. It's supposedly an honorable way to claim the throne, too, although I would question any landowner who uses that word while working conscripted witches to death." She scoffed. "Honor among landowners." Mateo laughed without amusement. "Honor is their religion as surely as givers are for workers. Per's ancestors were nothing if not pompous. Many of them believed that dying without honor would ban them from returning to life. They believed death would be their entry to the next life. Without honor, they are denied entry and are simply gone forever. Honor, supposedly, is fighting for your life." Then workers all die with honor. I agree. She frowned. While landowners believed in honor, workers believed in fate and givers. But Mateo seemed to straddle the lines. Do you believe in honor, Mateo? Not as landowners see it. Another of the men returned and reported something to Bernat. They spoke quickly, their voices a blur she couldn't make out. Finally, Bernat motioned the other guard toward the trees. He obeyed, positioning himself between the Poena and Mateo. One more, Bernat said to Mateo. One more what? Woman left to report back to us. Spies? She asked. Spies. Mateo parted the leaves again. Vittoria leaned forward and followed his gaze. Toward the top of the arena, the benches gave way to a flattened space beneath a canopy of woven fronds. Tables and lounge chairs filled the shaded area. Several female workers bustled around, carrying baskets filled with what appeared to be starched tablecloths. They're preparing for the event, muttered Mateo. During the test, many landowners and their wives will eat there, maybe several times, while waiting to hear what happens to us. No doubt there will be spells in place to protect them so they can enjoy their entertainment. Hode keeps dedicated staff at the arena. Those women live here. They sleep outside, fix the meals for the arena staff, and then serve guests at the games. The games? It's hard to see clearly with the jungle growing down there, but there's a fighting pit where landowners watch various barbaric events. Workers battling each other, animals fighting, you name it. The wall with hanging neck and leg manacles required no further explanation, nor did the obvious bloodstains on the walls, the floors, the rows closest to the bottom. The jungle continued to creep forward one budding plant at a time. Where it had overtaken the edge of the arena on the far side, full-sized trees had already grown. Who gave magic to such a horrific thing? The third guard returned, reported to Bernat, and fell into place near Vittoria. The second guard shifted to accommodate him. She felt marginally better for their presence. Mateo sent a questioning look to Bernat. No foul play suspected, Bernat said. The women report no interference from Romeo or his men so far. You expect your brother to cheat? Vittoria asked, voice lifted in surprise. Wasn't honor first and foremost? One always does. Thank you, Bernat. May we leave now? Bernat asked. I don't like it here. I can't guarantee Lady is safe if she can't transport away immediately. Soon. Bernat and his men had started calling her Lady after the betrothal announcement last night, an official title she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but she didn't want to take away from them. She tried to ignore it, but it made her grit her teeth, an ungainly reminder of a future she hadn't yet fully embraced. Shouts rang up from below, and Vittoria shifted closer to Mateo. One of the workers, in a vain attempt to hurl himself down the steep stairs to die, stumbled over a tool. The landowner in charge tossed the whip, caught the witch around the mouth, and yanked. A shrill scream issued from the witch's throat as he writhed on the ground. Lash after lash bit into his skin, his face, filleted halfway open, cheek dangling uselessly on the stone floor, chugged blood onto the ground. Vittoria blanched but didn't look away. Her stomach churned painfully. She thought she might vomit. I'm sorry, she thought to the man. I'm sorry. Mateo tensed next to her as the punishment continued until, finally, it stopped. The worker twitched once, shuddered, then lay limp on the stone. Blood pooled around him in a river. Vittoria, no. Her voice was husky but firm. Bernat glanced at her. Vittoria kept her eyes trained on the bloody stump of a witch and the humiliating agony of such a death. The other workers didn't look, didn't falter. They continued forming benches out of sand. The landowner returned to his previous position. The bloody arena claimed another life, and the world moved on. Honor, she muttered. Mateo took her hand. I'm sorry, he whispered. She nodded, and it was all she could do. A rustle in the jungle caught her attention. Another of Bernat's men appeared. Trouble, he whispered, just as the landowner below called out a halt to the workers. Mateo peered through the foliage as a figure emerged from a tunnel on the arena floor. Romeo turned, seemed to look right at her, and lifted a beckoning hand.